form a joint committee with Israel to convert the conceptual map.
القضية الفلسطينية ولا صفقة القرن. صفقة القرن لن تنفذ على أجسادنا. سوف ممكن في حالة واحدة إن لو إحنا على أجسامنا نحط أجسامنا هيك وتمر صفقة القرن.
From technical point of view, it is impossible to survive under this plan. Simply, you don't have any water resources. There is no available water upheld and into Gaza. Also, you cannot utilize any because underneath your land, which is very limited, you don't have any water resources storage in the aquifers. Jordan River already diverted and dried out, so under this plan, Palestinians should live with no water, which is impossible.
By fragmenting not only the Palestinians politically, but also geographically, by fragmenting the fragmented after Oslo and now with this deal of century.
In part one of this documentary series, we began a journey into occupied Palestine in order to find out why Donald Trump's plan for a new Israel-Palestine was declined by the Palestinian people. We investigated the issues of Jerusalem al-Quds, settlements, the annexation of the Jordan Valley, and took a brief journey into the history of the peace process. Along the way, we witnessed the murder of Palestinians and an escalated environment of violence throughout the occupied Palestinian territories. We now continue the journey, turning our attention to the issues of refugees, resources, and what Trump's assault on the Palestinians has meant for the people of the Gaza Strip. After having traveled to Jerusalem al-Quds, I headed to the city of Bethlehem to get a better sense of what locals thought of the coming annexation of their lands as part of Trump's plan. To find out more, I spoke with Bethlehem-born activist Mahmoud and asked him about what the future of his city would look like under the so-called deal of the century.
First of all, Israel built the segregation wall between Bethlehem and Jerusalem, which divorced the two cities from each other. And you know the historical twins between Bethlehem and Jerusalem, historically, religious level, economic, and social. And all this has been impacted by construction of the annexation wall between Bethlehem and Jerusalem. Moreover, the Israeli government annexed the land north of Bethlehem. And by the way, I am living in a small village in this area, which is surrounded by a big block of illegal Israeli settlement called Gush Etzion, where more than 100,000 Israeli colonists are living in this block. And in the east side of Bethlehem is like desert, which is like a natural reservoir of the district, and it has been announced as a military training zone. So 87% of Bethlehem district will be either isolated by settlements, by pass roads as natural reserves for the Israeli occupation, and from the north it has been already isolated. As you can see on this map, historically how the Palestinian territories has been shrunk. And the last one is the Trump plan, where I am living here. Actually, if you see the white territories are still under the Israeli control, which means my village, which is a tiny village, will be surrounded from three sides by the Israeli, under Israeli control, either by the apartheid roads, where we will not be able to use, only for settlers, or by the settlements themselves, or by closed military zones where we are not able to be.
A question that I was also seeking to have answered was how the situation currently affects Christian Palestinians and whether there are any tensions between Muslims and Christians in the city.
The richness of this diversity, the existence that we grown up as Muslims and Christians living in this city is one of the richness of the city. Even we cannot talk about coexistence because the seeds of Muslims and Christians grown up together in this city. Neither Muslims nor Christians came as immigrants to the city. They are the indigenous people. From the same family you can find Christians and Muslims, and both are Arabs. They have the roots in this city, and this city, that's where the richness, where the most shameful question that you ask a resident of Bethlehem is, what is your religion?
Coming here to a site that has so much holy significance, that has so much historical significance, and bearing witness to scenes such as this wall and the occupation here in Bethlehem, really almost brings a tear to the eye, seeing how the Palestinian Muslims and Christians who live side by side in unity here together are treated and are without dignity. And if this deal is accepted, we know that this land, which is part of Bethlehem, the holy city, which lies behind this wall, which is taken by the Israeli occupation forces, will be permanently separated from the heart of the city belonging to the Palestinian Muslims and Christians here.
The new unimaginable borders that Israel want to put on the ground in order to prevent the continuity between the Palestinian territories in Bethlehem and all over the occupied West Bank. That's impossible for Palestinians to have a state with this. Yet, this is not the end of the story. We see the hope. The hope that we are able to see is the resilience of the Palestinians, the everyday acts of the Palestinians that counter the Israeli policies and the American bias with the Israeli occupation. This resilience actually enabled Palestinians to stay in their land for now more than a century.
Many Palestinians I met argued that there had never been a real, genuine peace process, and any chance of one in the future died when the US government recognized Israel's capital as being Jerusalem al-Quds in early December of 2017. The move was rejected by the overwhelming majority of United Nations member states and motivated the Palestinians to take further grassroots action against Israeli aggression and the usurping of more land. This later led to a mass civilian mobilization in the Gaza Strip, giving birth to the Great March of Return, beginning on the 30th of March 2018 in the besieged coastal enclave, which had endured 13 years of blockade, as well as 8 large-scale military bombardments carried out against its population within that period, killing thousands of civilians. There are currently 2 million people living in the Gaza Strip, of which 52% are children. 70+% are also refugees, all packed into an area more densely populated than Tokyo, with a water supply which is 97% undrinkable, and the people having to live with only a few hours of electricity per day. In addition to this, Israel controls the airspace, electromagnetic sphere, and water. According to experts at the UN, the Gaza Strip is now officially considered as uninhabitable. Gaza's Great March of Return was a mass, non-violent series of demonstrations which took place against the Israeli separation barrier, in which Israeli soldiers killed over 330 unarmed Palestinians, injuring upwards of 40,000. No Israelis were significantly injured beyond scratches, and no Israelis were killed in what the likes of the BBC and CNN characterized as violent clashes. A UN investigative report adopted by the UNHRC has even accused Israel of directly targeting and intentionally killing Palestinian women, children, medics, journalists, senior citizens, and the disabled. Israel denies any wrongdoing and claims it only killed terrorists. One such killing claimed by Israel to have been committed in self-defense was that of 20-year-old Razan al-Najjar. Razan was a volunteer medic who, according to human rights organization B'Tselem, was deliberately killed by Israeli sniper fire.
رزان فتاة فلسطينية تبلغ من العمر 21 عام، كانت تعمل في مخيمات العودة كمتطوعة في الإغاثة الطبية والطواقم الطبية. كانت تعمل على إجلاب المصابين من خطوط التماس وتعمل على معالجتهم في المكان نفسه، وكانت متواجدة في الميدان باستمرار وهي ترتدي الزي الإسعافي. رزان تطمح مثل أي فتاة فلسطينية أو فتاة في العالم. رزان هي بنت في النهاية وعندها طموحها مثل أي بنت، إنها تكبر وتكمل تعليمها، إنها تتزوج ويكون لها بيت وأطفال، وإنها تعيش حياتها بكل أريحية، إنها تسافر وتطلع برا وتشوف العالم الخارجي من برا. ولكن للأسف الاحتلال قتل كل أحلام رزان. قام رزان الشاهد على جرائم الاحتلال الإسرائيلي هو ارتدائها لهذا الذي التي قتلت من أجله، والدماء التي ما زالت إلى الآن في هذا اللباس لرزان. وهذه رصاصة الغدر التي قتلت رزان بدم بارد. وهذه بطاقة رزان المعروفة دوليا أنها هي لها حق في الحماية لرزان.
The demonstrations had slowly phased out prior to the announcement of Trump's plan, with Gaza residents informing my team and I that the people had suffered a blow to their morale after their nonviolent resistance had failed to cause any real action to be taken against Israel. The world had left the Palestinians to die. In the West, many countries co-signed the Israeli justifications for their actions and attacked human rights activists as being anti-Semitic for pointing out the crimes noted in the UN and Human Rights Watch reports. Since the Trump-Netanyahu plan was announced, Israel has attacked and threatened to launch yet another military operation against Gaza, which the population there feel will be enabled by the Trump administration. As a non-violent struggle in the Gaza Strip had slowly declined in numbers, I wanted to see what the mood was like in the West Bank, in a village that had one of the longest-running weekly protest movements in all of Palestine.
We've come here to the West Bank village of Bil'in, which has been non-violently resisting the illegal Israeli occupation for 15 years after most of their land was taken away from them by the wall and the settlements you see behind me. So we've come here to investigate, after the announcement of the deal of the century, what this means for the Palestinian people living here.
I met up with the leader of the local non-violent demonstrations for the village, Abdullah Abu Rahma, and questioned him on the so-called deal of the century, as well as what steps are going to be taken to tackle it.
By this deal, I think another Nakba for Palestinian, and for this we, as activists for non-violence resistance in Palestine, we ask all of the places, all of the people to be in one group or to use this type of non-violence resistance to stop this deal. When we talk about the wall is separating between us and our land, and the Israeli plan to build more homes, more settlements behind the wall. For this, it's not, as the Israeli says, this is for security reasons, this is for confiscated more and more and more land from the Palestinians. They're throwing and shooting and firing cars, homes, farms. By this way, I think it's difficult to continue our life with this criminal people.
The wall built on Palestinian land, which the demonstrators are protesting to have removed, was ruled by the International Court of Justice to be illegal and demanded its immediate dismantlement. As the day went on, the violence only increased, with tear gas flying everywhere. It became abundantly clear that the Israelis wished to send a message to those protesting that they would pay a price for their resistance. In the early hours of the following morning, we were awoken by the sounds of gunshots. My cameraman Hamdi sprung into action and we went down to see what was going on. I quickly came to realize that the Israeli occupation forces had come to arrest children who they accused of throwing stones, a crime to Israel which can land you up to 20 years in a military prison. This child is only 14, and his arrest constitutes a violation of international law. The crime that you are seeing was no one-off. Israeli forces arrest and detain Palestinian minors on a near daily basis in the West Bank, with thousands of documented cases proving that Israel will detain and arrest children even under the age of 12. The campaigns of arrests only increased after the announcement of Trump's Palestine-Israel plan. After a rough night being awoken to the sound of soldiers entering and trashing Palestinian homes, I turned my attention to another core issue which is often overlooked: water.
If you ask Palestinians here, the occupation is not just the soldiers, it's not just the settlements, it's everything. It's the water. it's the land, it's how they will get electricity. How everything works here is under occupation. And see, the water here that you're seeing flowing past us was intended for Palestinians. But however, it has been diverted and goes to an illegal settlement. This is just one of many areas in the West Bank where you will see something as simple as water impacting the lives of Palestinians on a daily basis and making it so that they cannot live with freedom and with dignity, even to have their own water to supply themselves, to drink, to wash, and to power things.
To get more insight into how the occupation of water would affect a potential Palestinian state, I spoke to Raslan Mohammed Yassin, an engineer who worked on past Palestinian Authority proposals for peace deals, working on the plans for water allocation to a Palestinian state. We also traveled to a natural spring called Jaryut, where I was shown around by a local Palestinian farmer named Abu Hatem.
It is impossible to survive under this plan. And simply, you don't have any water resources. There's no available water up hills and into Gaza. And also you cannot utilize any because underneath your land, which is very limited, you don't have any water resources storage in the aquifers. And the Jordan River already diverted and dried out. So under this plan, Palestinians should live with no water, which is impossible.
The land you are seeing here would likely be confiscated under Trump's deal and would result in the displacement of farming families here, as well as the loss of access to water for the surrounding villages benefiting from Jaryut's water resources, one of the few springs that is still under control of Palestinians.
Israelis controlling all the water resources, from Jordan River to Tiberias Lake and groundwater aquifers, and nowadays even springs. So out of this conclusion is that they can give limited quantities to Palestinians, and maybe is around the 10% is going to Palestinian side, which is very, or it is under the international quantities or WHO standards for the per capita consumption for domestic use. Moreover, Israeli side already digged many wells, thousands of wells around Gaza Strip, and this of course will cut the natural flow into the Gaza aquifer that already will decrease the deterioration of the aquifer, which means that it will not be replenished or would not be recharged with a new or yearly recharge that could come into Gaza. And under this mining, of course, it will bring seawater intrusion, which will have an irreversible effect.
Even in the main city of Ramallah, water is regularly cut as Israel has complete control over the area's water resources, taking water from Palestinian land and selling it back to them at a higher price than what Israelis are required to pay.
Everybody will be just searching for water, and then he will be struggling for a glass of water. And since we have no any water resources and it is mainly controlled by Israel, so Israeli side, who is controlling the water resources, he can control the shape of our life in the future, which is, you can imagine that the life without water is very miserable.
For years, the amount of water allowed to Palestinians has sat below World Health Organization standards, with the human rights organization Al-Haq finding that Israeli settlers get 6 times more water than West Bank Palestinians on average. According to the UN OCHA, at least 180 West Bank communities are completely without any direct supply of water. Around 200,000 people in the Gaza Strip are also without any direct link to a water system, with the water there being 97% unfit for human consumption. The water situation in Gaza is so bad that leading scholar on Gaza's economy, Sarah Roy from Harvard University, has essentially said that Israel is allowing for the systematic poisoning of 1 million children in Gaza. Many Palestinians currently still live inside of Palestine, but unfortunately the large majority of Palestinians have not been able to remain on their lands after being displaced to all corners of the globe, many still stateless and living in refugee camps. The issue of refugees began with what is known as the Nakba, or the ethnic cleansing of Palestine between 1947 to 1949, when Zionist militias such as the Haganah, Stern Gang, and Irgun massacred thousands of Palestinians, and expelled around 800,000 people from their lands. Another ethnic cleansing of a further 300,000 people also occurred in June 1967 when Israel illegally occupied the West Bank, Gaza Strip, the Syrian Golan, and the Egyptian Sinai. The Palestinian right of return to their homes, that many still own the keys and deeds to, is a right enshrined in international law, with recognition ranging from UN Resolution 194 to the recognition of the right of return by leading human rights organizations such as Amnesty International. Yet, this right is denied of the Palestinians by Trump's deal, and after visiting countless refugee families, I began to understand why this final status issue, as it is referred to as, is unnegotiable for the Palestinian people. This is because the large majority of Palestinians are refugees, whether displaced internally or externally from their homelands, and any peace solution cannot reject these refugees. A just solution must include these refugees as human beings, and must also recognize these refugees as being Palestinian, something that the Israeli regime and US now wish to deny of the refugees, their very identity. With the US withdrawing funds to the United Nations Relief and Works Agency set up to support Palestinian refugees, it is clear that Trump's deal is nothing more than an Israeli and Christian evangelical right-wing plan to inflict a final blow against the Palestinians, making them irrelevant to the ongoing European settler colonial project. The issue of why Palestinians have historically entered into negotiations with right-wing administrations like Donald Trump's America and the current Israeli leadership was addressed famously in 1970 by Ghassan Kanafani when interviewed by Richard Carlton, and even though Kanafani was killed by an Israeli car bomb 2 years later, reflects the feelings of many Palestinians until this day.
You don't mean exactly peace talks, you mean capitulation, surrendering.
Why not just talk?
Talk to whom?
Talk to the Israeli leaders.
That's kind of conversation between the sword and the neck, you mean?
Well, if there were no swords and no guns in the room, you could still talk.
No, I had never seen any talk between a colonialist case and a national liberation movement.
To stop fighting, to stop the death and the misery, the destruction, the pain.
The misery and the destruction and the pain and the death of whom?
Of Palestinians, of Israelis, of Arabs.
Of the Palestinian people who are uprooted, thrown in the camps, living in starvation, killed for 20 years, and forbidden to use even the name Palestinians.
They're better that way than dead, though.
Maybe to you, but to us, it's not. To us, to liberate our country, to have dignity, to have respect, to have our mere human rights, is something as essential as life itself.
One thing was absolutely clear from my journey through occupied Palestine, and that was that the Palestinians were not going to give up their freedom anytime soon. So the question now remaining to be answered is, are Palestinians and Israelis to be considered as equal human beings and allocated the same rights in a real democracy? Or is the current system of Israeli privilege going to remain as Palestinian rights are trumped by the claims of security and wants of the privileged Israelis in a permanent state of apartheid? And if this is to be the case, what will separate the condition of humanity from the barbarism of the past, which we like to think we have since changed and progressed from?
احنا هدفنا واحد هو بس انقاذ واخلاع ونوصل رسالة للعالم انه احنا بدون سلاح قادرين نعمل كل شيء. هذا حب الجمانة للوطن، يعني هذا عمل انساني ما بدنا عليه مقابل، احنا بدنا نقدر تعبنا الله بس، مش مستعد يعني ما بدنا مقابل من اي حدا، لا رواتب ولا توظيف بدناش. كثير سألوا بابا بنتك هاي طب ما بتاخذ راتب هيك، حكى لهم انا بنتي بفتخر فيها انها بتقدم اشي انساني لابناء وطني، يعني كمان بنت، وخصوصي احنا المرأة عندنا منتقدة كثير في المجتمع، بس المجتمع لازم يتقبلنا غصبا عنه، لو بدوش يتقبلنا بإرادته بيتقبلنا غصبا عنه، لأن احنا عندنا قوة أكثر من أي راجل. القوة اللي احنا بنمتلكها، القوة اللي استرجلت فيها كأول مسعفة في الأسبوع الأول، بتحدى ألاقيها عند أي شخص يعني.